It was New Year's Eve, and Mark had drawn the short straw at work. While everyone else was getting ready to celebrate, he was stuck on the night shift at the small gas station on the outskirts of town. The station was always quiet, especially during the holidays. Mark didn't mind. He brought a thermos of coffee and his headphones, figuring he could pass the time listening to music. At 10:30 p.m., the first odd thing happened. A car pulled into the lot, headlights cutting through the falling snow. It idled there for a moment before pulling out without anyone getting out. Mark thought it was strange, but brushed it off. By 11 p.m., he noticed something else. The station's security camera, which usually flickered but never failed, suddenly cut out. The screen on the counter went black. Mark sighed, making a mental note to report it to his manager in the morning. At 11:20 p.m., a man walked in. He was tall and wore a long coat, his face partially obscured by a scarf and hat. There was something off about him. He didn't immediately go for the snacks or pay for gas. Instead, he stood by the counter, staring at the display of cigarette lighters. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond right away. After a long pause, he finally said, "You should leave before midnight." Mark laughed nervously. "Yeah, I wish. My shift's over at 1 a.m. The man's gaze met Mark's, his eyes strangely intense. "Midnight," he repeated, before turning and walking out the door, leaving no footprints in the fresh snow. Mark stood frozen for a moment, his coffee going cold in his hand. He glanced at the clock. It was 11:35 p.m. The station suddenly felt colder, the hum of the overhead lights unusually loud. A heavy sense of dread settled over him. Then the phone rang. Mark hesitated. No one ever called this late. He picked up the receiver, his voice wavering. "Hello?" A distorted voice on the other end whispered, "You've been warned." Mark's heart raced as he held the receiver to his ear. The voice on the other end was barely audible, but it carried an undeniable urgency. The line crackled before the voice spoke again, more clearly this time. "You've been warned. Get out before midnight." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. The calm, professional part of his brain tried to reason it away, some prank call, maybe just someone messing around on a night of celebration. But the sense of unease grew. His gut told him something wasn't right. "Hello? Who is this?" he asked, trying to sound more confident than he felt. There was a pause. The voice whispered, almost too softly to hear, "You'll see soon enough." Then, the line went dead. Mark hung up the phone slowly, staring at the receiver. The station felt colder now, the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing in his ears. His eyes darted around the small convenience store, noticing how everything seemed too still, too quiet. It was almost as if the entire world outside had stopped. The clock on the wall read 11:45 p.m. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run far away from the station, from whatever was happening, but he shook the thought away. He couldn't just abandon his post. He was the only one on shift. Just then, the lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the station into darkness. Mark jumped up, heart pounding, but before he could react, the emergency lights kicked in, casting an eerie, dim red glow over the room. He pulled out his phone, trying to use the flashlight, but the screen remained black. The battery was dead. Panic started to take hold, but Mark forced himself to breathe. This wasn't the first time the lights had gone out in the middle of a shift. He had been here long enough to know the quirks of the station. Maybe the storm had knocked something loose, something electrical. Then, the knocking came again. This time, it wasn't just on the door. It was louder, like it was coming from the walls, the windows. Rapid, insistent knocking, as though someone or something was trying to get in. Mark's pulse quickened. He walked cautiously toward the front door, his breath shallow. Through the frosted windows, he saw a figure standing outside, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't the man from earlier. This person was taller, their features obscured by the snow falling heavily from the sky. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring. "Hey!" Mark called out, feeling his voice tremble. "Can I help you?" The figure didn't respond. They simply raised a hand and pointed directly at the door, the motion slow and deliberate. Mark froze. The air around him felt charged, oppressive. A sudden rush of cold air blew through the cracks in the walls, and for the briefest moment, the lights went out again. He stood in the darkness, listening to the sound of his own breathing. When the lights flickered back on, the figure was gone. The snow outside was undisturbed. No footsteps, no sign anyone had been there. But the knocking had stopped. The clock read 11:55 p.m. The phone rang again, and this time, Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed it, his hands shaking as he brought it to his ear. "Get out now." The voice on the other end was urgent, strained. "You have 5 minutes." Mark slammed the phone down, his heart racing. 5 minutes. His mind scrambled, but he couldn't move. The air felt too heavy, as if time itself was slowing down. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the back room. Mark spun around, his eyes wide. He had locked that door when he arrived. There was no way anyone had gotten in. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. The knocking started again, louder now, more forceful, as if the walls were caving in around him. The clock ticked to 11:59 p.m. The knocking continued, louder and more frantic, reverberating through the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. It felt as though the entire station was shaking under the pressure. Mark's breath was ragged, his mind racing as the seconds slipped away. 11:59 p.m. He couldn't stand it anymore. The door at the back, where the crash had come from, was his only way out. He had to face whatever was there. He took a deep breath, forcing his legs to move. The emergency lights flickered as he hurried toward the back of the station, his footsteps loud in the silence, his pulse pounding in his ears. As he reached the door, he paused, his hand hovering over the handle. The knocking was deafening now, as though something or someone was trying to break through the very walls. With one final, desperate breath, Mark yanked the door open. The back room was empty. A wave of disbelief washed over him. The shelves were knocked over, boxes scattered across the floor, but there was no one there. Just the cold, abandoned room, filled with nothing but the unsettling sense of being watched. A muffled voice echoed through the air, too faint to understand. Mark spun around, panic crawling up his spine. Then he saw it. On the far wall, a mirror he hadn't noticed before was now hanging, reflecting his own wide-eyed, terrified face. But something was wrong. In the reflection, there was no emergency light, just complete darkness. And in the darkness, a figure stood behind him, a tall, shadowy figure with its face obscured by a scarf and hat. Mark turned around in a blur of fear, but there was nothing. No one. He whirled back to the mirror. The figure was gone. Midnight. The clock on the wall finally struck 12, and a deafening silence fell over the room. Mark could hear his own heart racing, the pulse in his ears ringing louder than ever. But the station was different now. The walls felt closer, the air thicker. The temperature had dropped even further, and his breath misted in the air. Mark's hands trembled, but he forced himself to move, heading toward the front door. When he reached it, he froze. The door was no longer locked. It was wide open. A cold gust of wind blew in, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the snow outside. Mark hesitated for a moment, but then he stepped out, eyes scanning the empty lot. The snow was falling heavier now, covering the ground in a thick layer, but there were no footprints. No signs of anyone having been there. The figure, the knocking, the voice, had it all been a nightmare? But as he stood there, the wind swirling around him, Mark noticed something on the ground near the door. A small, black box, wrapped in the same dark red paper with a silver ribbon. The same one that had been left for him earlier. The cold air pressed in around him, and the sound of the footsteps, faint and distant, echoed in his ears. And then he heard it again. A voice low, distorted. "You should have left when you had the chance." Mark turned around, but the station was now dark, the lights dead. His phone vibrated in his pocket, but when he pulled it out, the screen was cracked, the battery completely drained. A car's headlights suddenly cut through the night, blinding him for a moment. Mark squinted into the light, trying to make out the figure behind the wheel. But before he could move, the car vanished into the snowstorm, leaving only the hollow sound of wind sweeping through the empty gas station. Mark stood there for a long time, the cold biting at his skin, his body frozen in place, unsure if he was alone or not. And just before he turned to leave, the clock inside the station chimed again. The same distorted voice whispered through the wind. "It's never over." It was just after 11 p.m. when Rachel finally left the office. The streets were quiet for a New Year's Eve, but it was typical in the city. Everyone had either gone to parties or were home with family. The cold air stung her cheeks as she pulled her scarf tighter around her neck. After the long hours at work, she was looking forward to a peaceful evening. She walked briskly down the street toward her apartment, her mind still buzzing with the things she had to finish up for the new year. But as she turned the corner to her building, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting a message from a friend or family, but instead, it was a missed call from an unknown number. Rachel frowned, her finger hovering over the screen. She didn't recognize the area code, and she wasn't in the habit of answering calls from random numbers. Curiosity tugged at her, and she dialed the number back. The phone rang 3 times before it was answered. "Hello." A man's voice crackled through the speaker. "Hi, I just missed a call from this number," Rachel said, trying to mask the unease creeping into her voice. "Who is this?" There was a long pause, so long that she wondered if the call had dropped. Just as she was about to hang up, the man spoke again, his tone slow and deliberate. "It's about your mother." Rachel froze. What? What do you mean?" The voice on the other end didn't answer her question. Instead, it said something strange. "Don't go inside the building." Rachel felt a chill wash over her. Her apartment was just a few steps away, the building looming ahead. She had just left work. She had nothing planned for the night. What could this person possibly mean? "Who is this?" Rachel asked, her heart starting to race. "What are you talking about? I'm just heading home." The voice was now more urgent. "I said, don't go inside. They're waiting for you." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. What was happening? Before she could respond, the line went dead. For a moment, Rachel stood frozen, her phone in her hand, staring at the glowing screen. Every instinct in her told her to run, to leave the building and find somewhere else to go, but she couldn't move. She had no idea who had called, but something in her gut told her it wasn't just a prank. With shaky hands, she pocketed the phone and approached the entrance of the building. The hallway was dimly lit, the sound of her footsteps echoing as she stepped inside. The elevator was out of order, so she took the stairs up to her apartment on the 3rd floor. As she reached the 2nd landing, she noticed the door to apartment 2B was slightly ajar. The building wasn't fancy, just a quiet, old place with thin walls and creaky floors, but it was strange for anyone to leave their door open, especially this late at night. Rachel hesitated. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing down the hallway. No response. She stepped closer, and as she peered inside, her heart skipped a beat. The apartment looked like it had been ransacked. Furniture was overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and the window was wide open, letting in the freezing air. Then she saw it. A small, black notebook lying in the middle of the living room, a note attached to the cover. Rachel's hand trembled as she bent down to pick it up. The note read, "We're coming for you next." Rachel's hand shook as she held the notebook, her heart pounding in her chest. The note was simple, but the words felt like a threat. "We coming for you next." Her breath came out in short bursts as she stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the mess inside apartment 2B. The building was silent, save for the distant hum of the heating system. There was no sound of movement, no indication of anyone else being nearby. Rachel's phone buzzed again in her pocket, making her jump. She quickly pulled it out, half expecting to see another unknown number, but it was a message from her mother. "Are you home yet?" Rachel's mind raced. Her mother had no idea about the call she'd received, or the mess she was now staring at. What did this all mean? She typed a quick response, "I'm home now, everything is fine," but then hesitated before sending it. Was everything fine? She could feel something was terribly wrong. The feeling that she was being watched, that someone or something was waiting for her, lingered in the pit of her stomach. Rachel slowly backed away from the apartment door, glancing down the stairwell to the first floor. Her mind was telling her to get out of the building, to leave and find somewhere safer, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. She looked at the small notebook again, the note still staring up at her. She swallowed hard and took a shaky step backward. It was then that she noticed something on the floor, small, almost imperceptible marks leading from the door of apartment 2B, down the hallway, and toward the stairs. They looked like footprints, but they weren't made by shoes. They were barefoot. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, and she felt her pulse quicken. The marks seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the hallway, as though they were fresh. Slowly, they disappeared around the corner, leading toward the stairwell. She had no idea who or what had left them. But there was no question in her mind anymore that someone was inside the building, someone who shouldn't be here. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but she was too far gone to turn back now. She had to know what was happening. With the notebook still clutched in her hand, Rachel carefully followed the trail, her steps nearly silent as she moved closer to the stairs. She could hear her own breath, ragged and uneven, but every other sound in the building was drowned out by a ringing silence. As she reached the top of the stairs, she froze. The door to her apartment was wide open. Her stomach churned. She was sure she had closed it before she left, but there it was open, the light inside flickering. For a moment, she stood motionless, her mind trying to process what she was seeing. Was someone inside? Had they followed her up here? Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward cautiously, her hand hovering over the door handle. She didn't know who or what she was about to face. The door creaked open with a soft groan. Her heart was in her throat as she peered inside. The apartment was empty. Everything appeared exactly as she'd left it, the faint scent of coffee still lingering in the air. But then her gaze landed on the counter, and her blood ran cold. There, lying on the kitchen table, was a single black feather. Rachel stared at the black feather lying on the kitchen table, her breath catching in her throat. It was out of place, an odd detail in an otherwise ordinary apartment. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the room, the unsettling feeling growing with each passing second. The feather was unnaturally smooth, its color so dark that it seemed to absorb the light around it. She reached out, hesitating for a moment before touching it. The moment her fingers brushed against it, a chill ran through her body, like ice water flooding her veins. Something wasn't right. Everything about the apartment felt wrong, the air too still, the silence too heavy. Rachel's phone buzzed again, pulling her attention back to reality. She quickly pulled it from her pocket, her heart pounding. Another message from her mother. "Are you sure everything's okay? I'm getting worried. Call me when you can." Rachel didn't reply. She couldn't. The weight of the moment settled on her shoulders. The feeling that someone was still in the building, watching her, was overwhelming. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't just outside the apartment, it was already inside. She grabbed her keys and turned to leave, but before she could make it to the door, the lights flickered once more. The sudden darkness left her breathless. She turned back, her pulse quickening, as a cold gust of wind blew through the cracked window in the living room. The phone rang. Rachel jumped. The ringtone sounded louder than usual, echoing off the walls. She took a deep breath and answered, her voice trembling. "Hello." There was a pause, a long, drawn-out silence. And then, the voice she had heard earlier, the man from the call. "You shouldn't have gone in," the voice said, low and almost hypnotic. Rachel's heart sank. "What do you want from me? Who are you?" The voice chuckled, sending a shiver down her spine. "We've been watching you for a while. You've been warned." Before Rachel could respond, the line went dead again. The quiet that followed was suffocating. Her mind raced as she scanned the apartment, every shadow now a potential threat. The air felt thick, like it was closing in around her. The phone buzzed in her hand, a new message appearing on the screen. It was from an unknown number. "It's already too late." Her body went cold, and she glanced toward the door again. It was still open, but she couldn't bring herself to go out there, not without knowing what waited in the hall. And then, without warning, she heard it. A soft, dragging sound from behind her. Rachel spun around, but there was nothing. Just the empty apartment, the faint glow of the streetlights outside filtering through the curtains. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and quick, but she wasn't alone. She could feel it, the presence in the room with her. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision, fleeting, but enough to make her freeze. Her breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone again. But the screen was now black, the battery dead. The shadows grew longer, and the cold deepened. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Rachel never left the apartment that night. The next morning, the building's neighbors noticed the door to her apartment was wide open, but when the police arrived, no one could find her. The only things left behind were her keys, her phone, and a single black feather lying on the kitchen table. No one knows what happened to Rachel. Some say she left, disappeared without a trace. Others claim she met something far darker, something that had been waiting for her all along. But as the years pass, people still talk about the strange occurrences in the building, and some say they can still hear a faint whisper in the wind. "We're coming for you next." It was 10:45 p.m. on New Year's Eve when Noah finally arrived at his childhood friend Emma's house. He'd had a long year, work had consumed him, and he hadn't had time for anything outside of his routine. But this night was different. Emma had been insistent that he join her for a small gathering to ring in the new year. He couldn't say no. The house was quiet when Noah arrived, which struck him as odd. He knew Emma was having a few friends over, but there was no music, no chatter, no sign of a party. The only thing he could hear was the faint ticking of a clock from inside. Noah knocked softly on the door, expecting the usual cheer. When Emma answered, she looked slightly off, but she smiled and gestured for him to come in. "Hey, I'm so glad you made it," she said, but her tone was subdued. There was something about her voice that didn't quite match the usual warmth. The house was dark. The only light came from the soft glow of a string of Christmas lights hanging along the walls. The living room was empty except for a small table with a few snacks untouched. The fireplace was cold. Emma led him into the dining room, where a single candle flickered in the middle of the table. "No one else is here yet?" Noah asked, glancing around. He'd expected at least a few friends to be chatting or laughing by now. Emma shook her head slowly. "No, I don't think so." Noah frowned. "What do you mean? Didn't you invite anyone?" Emma hesitated. "I did. I don't know where they are. I've been calling them, but no one is answering. They should have been here by now. That was strange. Emma had always been organized, and if she said she invited people, they should have shown up by now. But Emma wasn't one to dwell on things, so Noah decided to brush it off. It was New Year's Eve. Everyone was probably just running late. They sat down, the silence between them heavy. Noah tried to make small talk, asking about her family and catching up on life, but Emma seemed distant. Every time Noah looked at her, her eyes were distant, as though she wasn't entirely present in the moment. A loud knock at the front door broke the silence. Noah stood up and walked over to answer it. But when he opened the door, no one was there. He frowned and stepped out onto the porch, his breath visible in the cold night air. There were no footprints in the snow, no signs of anyone being there. He glanced down at the ground and noticed something odd, a small scrap of paper. It was folded neatly, as if someone had placed it there carefully. Noah unfolded it. Written in black ink were just 2 words. "Leave now." He felt a cold chill run through him. He turned quickly to go back inside, but the door slammed shut behind him with a force that made him jump. Heart racing, Noah tried the door again, but it wouldn't open. Panic started to creep in. "Emma?" he called, his voice tight. There was no answer. He ran around the side of the house to the back door. It too was locked. The feeling of being trapped set in as Noah's mind raced. He looked through the windows. Everything appeared normal inside. But Emma wasn't in sight. Then, a low creak came from upstairs. Noah's blood ran cold. The house felt like it was closing in around him, and his gut told him something wasn't right. Without thinking, he sprinted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. He reached the top and was greeted by an eerie silence. No sign of Emma. He checked every room, heart pounding harder with each passing second. Finally, he reached Emma's room. The door was slightly ajar. "Noah," came her soft voice from inside. He pushed the door open. Emma was sitting on the bed, staring at the wall with an unnerving stillness in her expression. Her eyes were wide open, but they weren't focused on anything in particular. "Emma." Noah's voice was barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. Instead, her hand twitched, and she slowly pointed toward the far corner of the room. Noah turned, his stomach sinking. There was nothing there at first, just the shadows of the dimly lit room. But then he saw it. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure standing motionless. It was tall, shadow-like, and it seemed to absorb the light around it. Noah's breath hitched as he took a step backward. "Emma," he said again, his voice shaking. "Who's that?" Emma's head turned toward him slowly. Her eyes locked onto his, but her expression remained vacant. "They're here," she whispered. "They're always here." Before Noah could react, the figure in the corner stepped forward. Noah felt his heart stop. The next morning, Noah was found wandering the street, disoriented and confused. He couldn't remember how he got outside or what had happened in the house. Emma's phone was on the kitchen counter when the police arrived, but she was never found. Noah couldn't explain it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still waiting for him to return, that something else was left unfinished there. And every New Year's Eve, without fail, he hears a knock on his door. Noah tried to shake off the chilling events of New Year's Eve. The weeks following his strange experience at Emma's house felt like a blur, but one thing remained clear: the unanswered questions. Emma's disappearance, the eerie figure in her room, and the note he found on the porch haunted him every day. He couldn't stop wondering why Emma had acted the way she did, distant, almost as if she had been waiting for something. And then there was the feeling of being watched, the sense that someone had been with him, even though no one had been there. He tried to carry on with his life, focusing on work, trying to distance himself from the memory. But something inside him kept pulling him back to that house. It was as if it was calling him, compelling him to find out what had really happened. One evening, 3 weeks later, Noah drove past Emma's neighborhood. He hadn't planned it, he had just ended up there, his hands gripping the steering wheel, the familiar streetlights casting long shadows across the empty road. His car slowed as he passed her house. It looked exactly the same as it had on New Year's Eve, silent and dark, except for the faint glow of a street lamp near the driveway. He couldn't resist. Noah parked across the street and stepped out of the car. The cold air bit at his face, but he didn't care. He had to know if there was something he had missed, something that could explain Emma's behavior and disappearance. He approached the house slowly, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. The porch light flickered above him, casting long shadows across the front yard. He hesitated for a moment, but then reached for the door handle. The door was unlocked. It opened with a soft creak. The interior was exactly as he remembered: dark, quiet, and cold. The faint smell of dust lingered in the air. The house seemed abandoned, as if it hadn't been touched since New Year's Eve. He stepped inside, careful not to make a sound, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on him. He walked through the living room and into the dining room. Everything was in its place, no sign of struggle, no signs of anyone having lived there recently. But then his eyes fell on the small table, and his blood ran cold. There, sitting on the table, was the same candle he had seen that night. And beside it another scrap of paper. Noah's hands trembled as he unfolded it. The words were simple, yet they sent a jolt of fear through him. "They're still waiting." He froze. His heart raced as he looked around, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. The house was empty, but Noah couldn't shake the sense that he wasn't alone. He moved cautiously to the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. His pulse quickened as he reached the top and turned down the hall toward Emma's room. He hesitated before pushing the door open. The room was exactly as it had been the night of the party: quiet, still, with only the faintest trace of dust covering the furniture. But as Noah stepped inside, he noticed something new. On the floor, near the corner of the room, there was a mark almost like a footprint, but it wasn't clear. It was as if someone had dragged something heavy across the floor. His breath caught in his throat as he looked closer. There, in the corner of the room, where the figure had stood that night, was something he hadn't seen before. A small, faint glow, like the remnants of something that had been there and then disappeared. Noah knelt down to get a closer look. The light flickered, then vanished, leaving the room in complete darkness. He stood up quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get out. But as he turned to leave, he heard a sound behind him. A whisper. His stomach dropped. "Noah." The voice was faint, but unmistakable. It was Emma. He spun around, but the room was empty. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if something was closing in on him. "Noah, you shouldn't have come back." The voice was clearer now, and it sent a cold shiver down his spine. He turned toward the door, his legs feeling heavy, as though the very walls of the house were pushing against him. Just before he reached the door, the faint light from the corner of the room flickered once more, and something moved. A figure. It was standing in the doorway now, blocking his escape. Noah's heart raced as he froze, unable to move. The shadow grew larger, and for the first time, he realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was a person. But it wasn't Emma. "Noah," the figure said, its voice distorted, echoing in the small room. Noah couldn't breathe. He tried to move, but his feet were glued to the floor. His eyes widened as the figure took a step forward. It was a man tall, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. "I've been waiting for you," the figure whispered. The last thing Noah remembered before everything went black was the feeling of cold hands grabbing him, pulling him toward the darkness. The next morning, Emma's house was empty once more. No sign of Noah, no sign of anyone. The neighbors reported that the lights had flickered on and off during the night, but when they checked, the house was still and silent. But in the years that followed, strange things continued to happen in the neighborhood. People reported hearing voices late at night, whispers in the dark, and the faint sound of footsteps from an empty house. And every New Year's Eve, someone would knock on Emma's door. But no one ever answered. Noah never returned from Emma's house that night. His disappearance became a mystery, the kind that haunted the neighborhood for years to come. The police searched, but found nothing, no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Emma's house, once full of life, remained eerily quiet, abandoned by anyone who had once known it. Months passed, and the house stood vacant, yet every New Year's Eve, people in the neighborhood spoke of strange occurrences. The lights would flicker at midnight, shadows would move behind the curtains, and faint whispers could be heard drifting through the windows. It became a legend, a story parents told their children, a mystery no one could explain. One night, long after Emma had disappeared, a young couple, eager to start fresh in the area, moved into the house. They had heard the rumors, of course, but they dismissed them as old stories, nothing more than local superstition. The first night they spent there was quiet, peaceful. But as the clock struck midnight, something changed. The air grew cold, a chill so deep it seeped into their bones. They tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the house's age. But then, just like before, they heard it, a soft knock on the door. The man stood up to answer it, his heart pounding in his chest for reasons he couldn't explain. When he opened the door, no one was there. Just like before, a small piece of paper was left on the ground. This time it read, "It's not over." The young couple immediately packed their things and left, never to return. The house remained empty, and with each passing year, the mystery of the disappearances lingered, adding to the eerie reputation of the house on Elm Street. And every New Year's Eve, when the clock struck 12, there would be a soft knock on the door. But no one ever answered. No one ever came back.